2 hours ago, an internal Republican tracking survey crossed the desks of senior White House political advisors and reportedly stopped the morning briefing mid-sentence. Not a leak, not opposition research. A survey commissioned by the Republican National Committee itself, conducted across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the three states that form the structural spine of any viable electoral college path for the GOP in 2026 and beyond. The headline finding is the one nobody in the West Wing wants to say out loud. 61% of self-identified America First voters in those three states now believe the United States is fighting a war that serves Israeli interests, not American ones. 61%. Among independent voters in the Milwaukee and Detroit suburbs, the exact demographic that swung those states into Trump's column, the number climbs to 73. And among veterans under 40, the demographic that delivered Trump some of his most emotionally charged rally moments, it reaches 78. The man who stood on stage after stage and promised that American blood and American treasure would never again be spent on foreign wars that had nothing to do with American security is now presiding over a conflict that his own base is calling, in the language that cuts deepest in MAGA country, someone else's war. This is not a story the mainstream media invented. This crisis did not begin in the opposition. It began inside Trump's own house, and it is spreading in ways that senior Republican strategists describe privately as unlike anything they have seen inside a governing coalition in a generation. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the 48-hour window that changed everything. The phone call between Trump and Netanyahu that preceded the opening strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure was described by three people familiar with the conversation as a discussion in which Netanyahu presented one singular urgent argument: Iran is 6 weeks from a functional nuclear device. The window to act is now or never. Every day of delay moves Iran closer to a threshold that makes military action strategically impossible. Trump, who entered office with a publicly stated preference for negotiation over confrontation, who told voters at rally after rally that he would end wars rather than start them, made a decision inside that 48-hour window that his political team is now struggling to explain to the people who put him there. He authorized the operation, and in doing so, he crossed a line that his own America First brand had spent 8 years telling the Republican base would never be crossed. But this is where it gets serious, because the political damage is not coming from the left, it is coming from inside the tent. Joe Kent, the former Green Beret and congressional candidate who built his entire political identity around the America First framework, publicly broke with the administration within 72 hours of the strike's beginning. His statement was not measured or diplomatic. He wrote that American soldiers are now dying to protect a foreign government's regional ambitions, that this is precisely the pattern of elite-driven foreign policy adventurism that the America First movement was founded to end, and that any Republican who supports this war without a clear and compelling explanation of how it serves ordinary American families has abandoned the movement's founding principles. Kent is not a fringe voice. He is a signal that carries weight with the specific voters Trump cannot afford to lose. When figures like him move, the coalition moves with them. 13 American service members have died in the opening phase of operations. Not in a single dramatic incident that the news cycle processes and moves past in a week. In ones and twos, in the unglamorous operational friction of a regional conflict expanding in directions that Pentagon planners privately acknowledged they did not fully model before the first strike was authorized. 13 families, 13 funerals, 13 moments where the abstraction of geopolitical strategy becomes a flag folded at a graveside in a town that voted for Trump by 20 points. The political cost of each one of those funerals is not linear. It compounds. It personalizes. It converts a foreign policy debate into something that does not require a classified briefing or a think tank analysis to understand. It requires only the question now being asked in diners and factory break rooms and church parking lots across the industrial Midwest. Why are our kids dying for this? The financial cost has crossed $200 billion. That is not the full cost of a prolonged engagement. That is the opening phase cost, before the situation has stabilized, before any reconstruction framework has been discussed, before the second and third order economic effects of Persian Gulf instability have fully worked through energy prices, supply chains, and the defense industrial base. $200 billion in a domestic economic environment where Trump's core voters are already absorbing higher grocery bills, elevated mortgage rates, and the persistent anxiety of a manufacturing sector that has not fully recovered from the disruptions of the previous 4 years. The timing could not be worse. Every billion spent in the Persian Gulf is a billion not spent on the infrastructure revival Trump promised, the manufacturing comeback Trump promised, the border expansion Trump promised. The America First agenda and the war budget are now in direct competition for the same finite pool of political capital and government resources, and the war is winning. And what happened next stunned even the veteran Republican strategists who thought they understood how Trump manages political crises. The Nixon and Vietnam comparison did not originate with Democrats or with the mainstream press. It originated with conservative media. Tucker Carlson, whose audience represents perhaps the single most concentrated sample of the America First voter base anywhere in American media, made the comparison directly and without softening in a recent broadcast. He did not argue the situations are historically identical. He argued the structural pattern is identical. A president who won the White House by promising to end foreign military overreach now finds himself defending an escalating conflict that his own political coalition views as a fundamental betrayal of the mandate he was given. Nixon won in 1968 promising to end Vietnam. He expanded it into Cambodia. The political consequences did not arrive immediately, but when they did, they ended a presidency and reshaped the Republican Party for a decade. Carlson's audience heard the implication without needing it spelled out. The man you trusted to bring the boys home is the man sending them out again. Now here is what the Netanyahu-Trump dynamic actually reveals about the structural vulnerability that made this moment possible. And to understand it fully, you have to go back further than the 48-hour phone call. You have to understand a relationship that has been decades in the making and that carries an asymmetric quality almost no one in the American political press has been willing to describe plainly. Netanyahu and Trump have known each other since the 1980s. Their personal rapport is genuine, documented, and built on a shared instinct for transactional politics that both men have at various points described as mutual respect. But the relationship has never been between equals, and it has never operated without strategic purpose on Netanyahu's side. During Trump's first term, Netanyahu was the foreign leader who most consistently and skillfully understood how to frame Israeli priorities in language that made them sound like American priorities. The Abraham Accords are the most transparent example. Marketed to the American public as a historic peace breakthrough, they were structurally a diplomatic realignment that gave Israel normalized Gulf relations while quietly removing the Palestinian resolution requirement that had anchored every previous American-brokered peace framework for 40 years. Trump received a headline and a legacy moment. Netanyahu received the regional architecture he had spent 2 decades trying to construct. The exchange was structurally unequal, but the domestic political reward for Trump, the rally applause, the evangelical base enthusiasm, the wall-to-wall Fox News coverage, the Nobel Peace Prize nominations, was immediate and real enough that there was no political incentive to examine the underlying terms. The same dynamic drove the lead-up to the current conflict with a precision that, in retrospect, looks less like improvisation and more like a campaign. Netanyahu spent over a year through private diplomatic channels, Kushner meetings, and carefully timed intelligence briefings delivered to American national security officials, constructing a single, unavoidable argument inside the Trump administration's decision-making process. Iran's nuclear timeline has collapsed. The window for negotiation has closed. The only American president in a generation who possesses both the political will and the domestic base support to authorize military action is the one currently in office. That framing was not arrived at accidentally. It was engineered specifically for Trump's psychology, which Netanyahu understands with a precision that most American political operatives would find unsettling. Trump does not respond to abstract strategic analysis, to risk matrices, to long-form intelligence assessments. He responds to the language of winning and losing, of historic strength versus historic weakness, of legacy-defining action versus legacy-destroying hesitation. The case for military action against Iran was constructed entirely in that register, delivered in that language, and accepted on exactly those terms. The America First voter base was never part of that conversation. They were told the Abraham Accords were a triumph. They were never told the accords had quietly created a structural obligation that would, under a specific set of circumstances, override the no foreign wars promise that was the emotional core of everything they voted for. The American business community has now added an economic dimension to the political damage. Energy futures remain elevated at levels that translate directly into pump prices American consumers feel every time they fill a tank. The National Association of Manufacturers has warned that Persian Gulf instability creates supply chain uncertainty that manufacturing investment decisions cannot absorb without a visible resolution timeline. Defense contractors are benefiting in the short term, but the broader industrial economy is not. Goldman Sachs revised its second quarter growth projection downward, citing conflict-related uncertainty as a primary drag factor. These are not abstract numbers in a macroeconomic report. They are the numbers that show up in the economic confidence surveys that track most closely with presidential approval ratings. And those surveys are moving in the wrong direction at the worst possible moment. Internationally, the isolation is now structural. NATO allies who were not consulted before the strikes began have declined to endorse the operation in any meaningful public form. Germany called for an immediate ceasefire framework. France raised concerns about the legal basis for the strikes under international law. The United Kingdom, typically the closest American partner in any military operation, limited its public statement to expressing hope for rapid diplomatic resolution without endorsing the action itself. Even Gulf states that had quietly supported pressure on Iran communicated through private diplomatic channels that the scale and pace of the operation exceeded what they were prepared to publicly back. The result is a military campaign conducted without the alliance architecture that provides American military action its international legitimacy at precisely the moment when Trump needs allied cover to make the argument that this was a globally endorsed response to a genuine and imminent threat rather than an Israeli-requested intervention delivered by an American president who, when the moment came, could not say no to a phone call. Trump now faces a political geometry heading into the 2026 midterms that contains no clean exit. He cannot end the conflict quickly without it appearing that the operation failed its stated objectives, handing his critics the narrative that 13 American lives and $200 billion purchased nothing durable. He cannot escalate further without accelerating the coalition fracture that is already quantifiably visible in the internal polling numbers. He cannot pivot to diplomatic framing without effectively acknowledging that the total victory language used to justify the operation in its opening week was either strategically premature or deliberately misleading. And he cannot ignore the 2026 electoral math, which shows that the swing districts most likely to flip in a midterm environment are precisely the districts where the America First promise carries the most emotional weight and where the betrayal narrative is now gaining the most traction. 2 hours ago, White House political advisors were staring at poll numbers that should not exist inside a functional America First coalition. 2 hours later, they have no answer for the central question now being asked, not by the opposition, not by the press, but by the voters who made this presidency possible. You told us America comes first. You told us no more wars for other people's interests. You told us our kids would not bleed for foreign agendas. 13 of them are gone. $200 billion is gone, and the man who authorized it is the same man who looked into the camera and promised this time would be different. The Nixon comparison is no longer a Democratic talking point. It is coming from the base. It is coming from veterans. It is coming from conservative media, and it is arriving with a question attached that the White House right now has no answer for. Was America first, or was Israel?